Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another serial killer spotlight video. Well, this week I'm going to be talking about the crimes of the Golden State Killer. This has been a highly requested video ever since he was finally arrested in April 2018 at 72 years old and his identity was revealed. I always said I was going to wait until after a trial to film this video, but we now know that there's not going to be a trial here. He's pled guilty, which makes the jobs of so many people a hell of a lot easier and saves a long and painful trial for the surviving victims and family members. Let me tell you about the crimes of Joseph Deangelo, who for years was known by the moniker the Golden State Killer, or the East Area Rapist, or the original Night Stalker, or the Visalia Ransacker. That's right, this man committed so many crimes in so many different places that he had multiple names. The Golden State Killer refers to the crimes of this man as a whole, once all his separate crimes in separate jurisdictions had been linked. Due to the extent of the crimes committed by this man, I'm not going to be able to go into detail by each and every one. He committed at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes and over 100 burglaries, all in California between 1974 to 1986. I was first educated about this case in early 2018 when I read this book, Michelle McNamara's book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark. And it's really not often this happens to me with books or true crime cases, but it affected me so much I couldn't even bring myself to finish this. But what I did read stuck with me all these years later, and actually in filming this video and researching this video I have read quite a big chunk of this more. I've only got a few pages left now, so I would recommend this book. It's just a lot. Joseph Deangelo's crimes are truly horrifying, and Michelle writes about them in shocking detail, bringing you into each scene as the crimes happened. She was obsessed with this man who committed numerous sexual assaults and multiple murders, yet no one seemed to pay him too much attention. He'd committed his crimes, then just quietly disappeared. He didn't even really have a name for all of his crimes until she gave him one, the Golden State Killer. Sadly, Michelle died before Deangelo was apprehended, but many give her the credit for bringing renewed attention to this case and potentially leading to his capture. On the 29th of June 2020, Joseph Deangelo appeared at a hearing in California at the Sacramento State University Union Ballroom. In COVID times, of course, it couldn't be held in a normal small courtroom. He entered a plea of guilty on 74 counts, including 13 counts of first-degree murder. The Sacramento County Deputy District Attorney announced a plea arrangement, which took the death penalty off the table in exchange for the guilty pleas.
Anticipated that you will receive 11 consecutive life without the possibility of parole sentences with 15 concurrent life sentences. Additional time for weapon enhancements will be imposed as mandated by law. Do you understand that as well, sir?
Yes.
The aforementioned uncharged acts that you will be admitting to having occurred in Sacramento County, Yolo County, San Joaquin County, Stanislaus County, Contra Costa County, Alameda County, and as well as Santa Clara County. As a result of these admissions to these uncharged acts, the above listed counties have agreed to abstain from charging you with any offenses stemming from or related to those specific events for which you'll be admitting responsibility. All victims and victims' family members of the charged as well as the uncharged acts will be able to give a victim impact statement at judgment and sentencing without limitation as to time and without limitation as to content. At the time of judgment and sentence, you'll receive 11 consecutive life without the possibility of parole sentences with 15 concurrent life sentences. Additional time, as stated, for the weapon enhancements will be imposed as mandated by law. You will not be considered for any other sentence. Do you understand, sir?
Yes.
In addition, you agree to withdraw all pending motion as to today's date, June 29th, 2020. As a condition of this plea, you will agree to waive any and all appellate rights. Do you understand the terms of this plea, Mr. Deangelo?
Yes, Your Honor.
She also said in addition that he'd agreed to admit guilt in a multitude of crimes for which he had not been charged, some of which, such as the burglaries and some of the rapes, had passed the statute of limitations. Throughout the hearing, prosecutors from all the different counties across California that he'd struck in described a series of murders, rapes and burglaries. Deangelo repeatedly said the words guilty and I admit over and over again. The judge asked if he understood that he would receive 11 consecutive life sentences without parole. He replied, yes. The final step in this case is the sentencing phase, which is to begin the week of the 17th of August 2020, where the victims and family members will be allowed to give impact statements. The judge has promised there'll be no limitations on the length of time these statements take, and the process is expected to last several days. After that, the case is pretty much done apart from the financial restitution of the victims. 11 life sentences is not a small sentence to receive, but some would argue, including me, that that's just not enough. He must have committed some pretty horrific crimes though, right? So let me tell you about the things that this evil man did, and he really is about as close to evil as you can get. What we know starts back in April 1974 when Joseph Deangelo earned the nickname the Visalia Ransacker. The Visalia Ransacker is a name given to a then unknown offender who operated in the farm town of Visalia, California in the mid-70s. He operated almost exclusively in a small area in the southern half of town, committing over 100 burglaries. During this time period, his crimes were most often described as prowling or ransacking, occasionally attempted break-ins. The ransacker had a very unique way of operating, an MO very similar to the later crimes of the East Area Rapist. His movements were usually very similar, with the typical crime going as follows. Whilst the resident was out of their home for the evening, the ransacker would enter the property through an open door or unlocked window, or occasionally he would force his way in. Once inside, he would open more windows and potential exit points, allowing for a quick escape if the homeowners returned. He would wedge a chair against the front door or put the chain lock on and place cups and trinkets against doors that would make noise and alert him if somebody else entered the house. And then the ransacking would begin. He would open every drawer in the house and rummage through the contents. He would collect all of the women's underwear he could find and place them on a surface, usually the bed. He would usually arrange them in very particular ways, for example stacking all of the pads in a particular place or lining up all of the bras. Sometimes he would bring along hand lotion or find some in the house and then masturbate at the scene. Homeowners would return to find pornographic magazines and photos of women or girls left in the open. As if this wasn't traumatising enough for the residents, he would usually like to cause a bit of damage in the house as well, unnecessary damage. He'd pour wine on carpets, push over bookshelves, spray shaving cream on the furniture, just because he could. And of course he would steal keepsakes as well, trophies from his victims, random things like piggy banks, class rings, wedding rings, engraved bracelets, always something that he would assume meant something to the homeowner. One of his biggest calling cards was how he would always take a single earring from a pair, never a full pair, just a single one. Sometimes he would take more practical things though, like clothing, canned food, dishes, even once stole a stereo. From the investigations, it became clear that this wasn't only a case of ransacking. The perpetrator was also a prolific peeper and prowler as well. Shoe prints found at many of the crime scenes matched random shoe prints and been found under windows in gardens all over town. He would peep on the same families for many months, a lot of the time focusing on families with teenage daughters. On September 11th, 1975, he stepped his crimes up a notch when he tried to kidnap a 16-year-old girl called Beth Snelling, who he'd been watching for several months. He entered the home of the Snelling family whilst they were asleep and tried to drag Beth out of the house. Her father, Claude Snelling, was woken by the commotion and runs out of the back door, finding a man attempting to kidnap his daughter. The assailant shoots Claude twice and then flees the scene, leaving Beth behind and for Claude to stagger back into the house for help. He later died. Beth was interviewed a number of times by the Visalia police, in which they tried to help her recall any physical characteristics of the killer. She was even hypnotised at one point. She described him as a white male with light skin, between 5'8" and 5'11", possibly in his late 20s, medium to stocky build, angry eyes, strong hands and a masculine low raspy voice. When he spoke, it sounded like a growl apparently. He wore a dark ski mask with white zigzag stripes with the eyes, nose and mouth cut out, as well as dark clothing and shoes that squeaked, possibly tennis shoes. Based on the colour of the hair on his hands and eyebrows, Beth guessed that he either had blonde or light brown hair. You'd think that now he was a murderer, the assailant would change tactics, change the area in which he committed the crimes. But weirdly, the ransacker brazenly continued, even escalated his crimes. His stalking became more aggressive. He started calling potential victims and leaving them harassing messages. He even started to enter more houses where the homeowners were actually present at home. In December 1975, a homeowner noticed a fresh shoe print under her daughter's bedroom and bathroom window. She had been a victim of the ransacker months earlier, so the very next night 2 officers show up to subtly surveil the property, and of course the ransacker turns up just as predicted. An officer confronts him and manages to get a good look at the man's face. The man shoots but misses the officer, who walks away unharmed. Despite a huge police search being immediately put into action, including bloodhounds, the ransacker managed to escape. This is the last confirmed event involving the ransacker, but there's a handful of incidents from 1976 which are likely to be the same person. But there's no doubt his crimes quietened down after this, and then the Visalia Ransacker just faded into the background. But a criminal like this doesn't just stop though. He's never satisfied that he's finally been enough of a pervert. Unless he died or was arrested for another crime, it was a given that he was going to continue. Maybe he just moved away and now he was another town's problem. That's what the Visalia police thought. We now know that he had indeed just moved away to Sacramento, California, where his crimes escalated from burglary to rape and eventually more. It began in June 1976, and over the coming years he would target many women in their bedrooms in their quiet, upper-middle-class suburban neighbourhoods, from Sacramento to San Ramon. These are the attacks of the East Area Rapists, which are mostly focused in a small geographic area in Sacramento around Rancho Cordova, Carmichael, Citrus Heights and Ripon Court, and each victim noted the perpetrator as being a young white male between 19 and 30 years old with dark blonde or brown hair. In the earlier attacks, he'd break into homes where no men were present, often one-storey homes near a wide open space that would allow for a quick escape. For weeks before the attacks, he would prowl the streets. He would call victims and breathe down the phone or give them creepy messages or just hang up. He would plan it methodically and then wait to strike until the victims were alone. The first attack happened on Paseo Drive in Rancho Cordova on the 18th of June 1976 at 4 AM when a woman was raped. In June 2016, 40 years later, this victim spoke to the FBI about her ordeal, saying, "I didn't hear him come in, I didn't hear anything. And all of a sudden, there was somebody standing in my door, the bedroom door. And I looked up and I thought it was my dad at first, you know, because he drives weird hours and he might have come in early, because it was early in the morning. And nope, it wasn't my dad. So he came in, he had a ski mask on and he jumped on the bed and had a knife. I don't remember exactly what he said. Something to the effect of, you know, don't scream, don't, you know, whatever. And he tied my hands behind my back." She then described how after he raped her, he goes through her room, taking money out of her purse, taking coin books and a piece of jewellery. I'll leave a link down below in the description to an audio recording of this interview if you'd like to listen. The woman thinks that the rapist had been following her for a while beforehand. She recalled seeing an older car several times the month before. Every time he drove past her, he would turn to face away. Then she started receiving hang-up phone calls, and then she was attacked. The East Area Rapist was a big fan of an ominous phone call. The next attack was on the 17th of July in Carmichael, the victim being a teenage girl. Then another attack in August in Rancho Cordova, and then another in Citrus Heights in September. And then the October comes around and the attacks start happening at an alarming rate of 4 in just 1 month, 2 of those taking place on the night of October 18th. Not all of the attacks were completely out of the blue, some were of course, but also many were preceded by victims and neighbours spotting some odd behaviours nearby. A strange car parked on the street, gates being opened, hang-up phone calls, nearby homes being burgled. These women were all watched beforehand. None of the earlier attacks happened in homes where men were present. Police believed that the offender would conduct extensive reconnaissance in his targeted neighbourhoods. He would often target multiple houses in the very same road. An article from the Los Angeles Times entitled "Man in the Window, a Rape in the 70s" by Paige St. John writes of the December 1976 rape of 15-year-old Chris McFarlane. She was alone in the house practicing piano when she heard the sound of fabric tearing. She paused for a second before resuming playing, but suddenly there was a man behind her pressing a knife to her throat. He said, "Make a move and I'll kill you," for slipping prepared bindings around her wrists. These would later turn out to be shoelaces from a pair of her sister's shoes. He stuffed a cloth from his pocket into her mouth and tied another around her head as a gag and pushed her to the garden picnic table. Chris had only been alone for 10 minutes, her parents at a Christmas party and her sister at work. Her best friend had only just left. She thinks that he was waiting in her house the entire time, that he'd been stalking the house for days. She was attacked, raped for over 2 hours before the man suddenly disappeared and her ordeal was over, or at least her physical ordeal. And the attacks just continue. The 1970s was a time in which serial rapists were very active. Police departments across America were overwhelmed with reports of rape. This was a world in which more women were getting bodily autonomy. Women are realising that they could say no, that the goal of life wasn't just to get married and have babies. And this leads to more men taking what they want by force, although of course East Area Rapist was a fairly extreme case of this. This all hit at a time when the attitudes towards women and sex were changing, but the courts and authorities hadn't quite caught up. Sacramento reportedly had at least 4 serial rapists active at this time. Rape was a crime that got a sentence as short as 1 year, if it even reached the courts. The statute of limitations was so short that evidence was often just thrown out before a serial rapist even reached their next victim. Police weren't trained well in how to deal with victims of rape or sexual assault, and therefore they often just focused in on the wrong things at crime scenes, looking at the burglary aspect as more important than the actual rape. I think the general attitude can be explained, and the East Area Rapist was often described by the police as gentlemanly, apart from the rape of course. He could rape these women, but because he did it in a kind of polite way, this made him a gentleman. And of course, if even the police couldn't really deal all that well with the concept of rape, then neither could the media. Many publications refused to even publish the word rape. The Sacramento media barely even reported what was going on at the time, but of course, communities talk, and the public soon realised that there was something going on. Someone was bringing harm to the women of Sacramento. Soon there was no choice but for the police to share brief details of what was happening, although they were hesitant because they said they didn't want to ruin their chances of catching the perpetrator at a stakeout. Although this reasoning doesn't quite make sense, as the press obviously wouldn't be reporting any stakeouts that were happening anyway. The authorities first held a neighbourhood meeting to keep people in the loop after the double attack on October 18th, but it wasn't for many more months that people would feel this intense panic over what was going on until the police really just laid down their cards and said, like, this is happening. Gradually the police felt like they had a good idea of the kind of man they were looking for. They knew how he operated, they could begin to guess his moves over time. Time after time, officers canvassing neighbourhoods would hear about how people saw somebody in the bushes sneaking around, or heard somebody scratching at the back door. Even his prowling became predictable, so the police asked people to report anything and everything. But then on April 2nd, 1977, he suddenly changes how he operates when he attacks his first couple. Did he know the police were onto him? And this would eventually become his preferred form of attack. That night he attacked at 3:20 AM in Orangevale, which was strangely out of the way for the East Area Rapist. A couple and their 2 children were in the house. From now on, couples would begin to wake up to find the rapist, usually wearing gloves and a ski mask, pointing a gun at them. He would break in through a window or sliding glass door before awakening them with a torch. He would bound the victims with ligatures, often pre-prepared shoelace which he either found at the property or brought with him. He would blindfold and gag them with towels that he'd ripped into strips. The female would often be forced to tie up the male first in incredibly tight bindings. He would then separate the couple, stacking dishes on the male's back with threats of what he would do if he heard them rattle. He would then rape the woman in a separate room multiple times for hours. But rape wasn't enough for this man. He'd often preface his attacks by saying that he needed money or sometimes needed food for his van, perhaps in an attempt to put the victims into a false sense of security, in an attempt to make it easier to restrain them. Once he'd finished the rape, he would begin to ransack the house, going through wardrobes and drawers, making a hell of a mess. He would eat the food in the kitchen, take beer out of the fridge. He would steal personal items, little trophies such as jewellery, and only occasionally stole cash, even though that's what he usually told them he was looking for. He would creep away after cutting the phone lines, leaving his victims bound and unsure if he'd left and they were safe to move. And then they'd be unable to call for help once they did. He loved to play mind games. As I mentioned previously, he would choose houses that had easy escape routes on foot. He would also often ready the houses for attack beforehand. He would break in the day before and unlock certain locks, turn off ACs, remove bullets from guns, and hide the items he would later use as ligatures. His victims all noted that this man, whoever he was, had an unusually small penis and would often force them to manually masturbate him, which does paint a detailed picture of the police as the kind of man they're dealing with and the potential motivations behind the attacks. According to the LA Times article, the sheriff kept most details of the prowling and the nature of the rapes themselves secret, gagging the local media. They couldn't share this kind of information even if they found it out. I totally understand why they'd want to keep details of the rape themselves quiet, but it seems strange not to share details of the prowlings, let people know the kind of thing they're looking out for. An article from the Gettysburg Times from May 20th, 1977 reads, "Porch lights burn all night, lock sales have soared, a citizens group is offering a reward of more than $10,000. There is talk of vigilante groups cruising the streets with CB radios in search of this man." By this point, at least 23 people had been known to be attacked by the East Area Rapist, the name he'd now been dubbed in the media. The article came on the back of an attack that happened the previous Tuesday, where the rapist promised he would kill his next 2 victims. This was the first time that murder had been threatened along with the rapes, and Sacramento County was thrown into a state of panic. This didn't stop the East Area Rapist though, who in response attacked a couple in Sacramento's South area, very close to the office of a dentist who organised a lot of the civilian groups. The police told women to defend themselves, get new locks, get a gun, get a dog. And it seems like this did make a difference because he does go quiet for 3 months, before striking again in nearby San Joaquin County in September. The attacks then continue as normal, him getting braver again as time goes on. On 2 occasions, he attacks young teenage girls whilst the parents sleep nearby, not a clue that anything is going on. He would lock children in rooms whilst he attacked the parents, and his attacks as the East Area Rapist would continue until July 1979. In this time it's thought that he did kill, but only once, or 2 people on 1 occasion. A young couple from Sacramento, Brian and Kate Maggiore, were walking their dog in Rancho Cordova on the night of February 2nd, 1978. I can't find loads of detail about their murders, but it seemed they encountered a man during their walk. The encounter soon turned violent and the couple tried to flee the situation, but they were both shot as they ran and they died of their wounds later in hospital. Investigators believe that they encountered the East Area Rapist, perhaps confronting him when they saw him prowling. In his latest hearing, Deangelo did indeed enter a guilty plea to these murders. And it seems like after this, East Area Rapist only attacked again in Sacramento 1 more time, for focusing their remaining attacks in Stanislaus and Yolo counties before disappearing again for 3 months and then changing to Contra Costa. And on the 5th of July 1979, the East Area Rapist attack stopped. Did he move again? He did indeed. Joseph Deangelo moved at this time to Southern California, which is where his attacks as the original Night Stalker would begin. The original Night Stalker attacks weren't actually linked to the East Area Rapist crimes for decades due to the separate jurisdictions and a difference in the MOs. This time he aimed to kill. There was one Sacramento detective who insisted for years that the attacks were connected, but the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office down in Southern California attributed them to a local career criminal. Even all of the crimes I'm about to describe weren't originally connected. The link was only made via DNA testing all these years later. The first attack attributed to the original Night Stalker happened on October 1st, when he broke into a home in Goleta and ordered the woman to tie up her boyfriend. Then the intruder tied her up. He rummaged around the house, he asked for money but didn't seem to care all that much about it. They heard the intruder chanting to himself, "I'll kill him, I'll kill him." So the woman used all of her strength to escape her bindings. She ran out of the house screaming and her boyfriend also managed to escape, still bound, into the garden. The intruder, realising now they'd drawn too much attention to what was going on, fled on a stolen bicycle, and a neighbour who just so happened to be an FBI agent chased the intruder, who abandoned the bike and a knife and ended up fleeing on foot. The couple were able to give a vague description of the man. White male, dark hair, 5'10" or 5'11", around 25 years old. But then after that, no one would ever live to describe him again. It goes quiet for a couple of months until his next attack on 30th of December, where Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning were shot dead at Robert's condo in Goleta. The estimated time of death was around 3 AM, which is when neighbours thought they heard gunshots. Robert and Deborah had been bound with twine, and there's evidence to suggest that at one point Robert broke free of his bindings and actually fought back. He had 3 gunshot wounds in his back and his chest, and Deborah had a single wound to her upper left back of her head. There was actually a turkey carcass discarded on the patio at the scene. It seemed like at some point the intruder had helped themselves to the leftover Christmas dinner from the fridge. Police found shoe prints with a star-shaped pattern from a pair of Adidas trainers. They found a trampled flower bed at a vacant house next door as well, which had signs that somebody had been squatting in there. There was actually nylon twine left behind in this house, the same kind of twine that the original Night Stalker often used. Neighbours reported break-ins and ransackings in the hours before the murder. One neighbour reported that a white man had brutally punched their poodle in the eye. Over the coming months, multiple couples were attacked and murdered in similar ways. All of the women were raped. Charlene and Lyman Smith were bludgeoned to death with a log. Keith and Patrice Harrington were also bludgeoned. Manuela Whittu was bludgeoned, and then Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez were also bludgeoned. They were the last victims for quite a while. In each case, the original Night Stalker would break into a home by prying open a window or a door. After the first failed attack, he then began to take all potential evidence with him, removing the bindings of his victims and taking it with him. But then the original Night Stalker goes silent, and the people of Southern California finally relax. It seems like whoever this man was, he'd either moved on or met his fate. Until May 4th, 1986, 5 years later, when he struck once again for the final time. 18-year-old Janelle Cruz was raped and bludgeoned to death by a possible pipe wrench at her home in Irvine. Although the case went quiet, this was one that the Santa Barbara detectives would always come back round to. I think it was in the year 2000 that the link between all the original Night Stalker cases was finally made. 10 bodies and 2 surviving victims. It was 3 years before this, in 1997, that the Contra Costa County's crime lab even definitively made the link between their 3 East Area Rapist cases via DNA testing. Before this, all they had was a lot of very similar crimes that they assumed was done by the same person, but nothing definitively to prove they were all actually committed by the same guy, but now they knew. But whilst they could now prove that some of these cases were linked, the DNA didn't actually lead anywhere, and they knew they'd have to wait for DNA technology to advance before they could get a more accurate DNA profile. It was just a waiting game. They knew the technology would catch up eventually, but not in the 90s. And then in 2001, the news hit that they'd been finally able to link the attacks of the East Area Rapist to those of the original Night Stalker, something that had been suspected for a few years by this point, but only now confirmed. Then 2 days after the news was made public, a phone rang in a house in East Sacramento. An East Area Rapist survivor answered the phone, and she immediately recognised the voice on the other end, which said, "Remember when we played? It was him." This man had been silent for 15 years. Many police assumed him dead or incarcerated, the only explanations as to why he would have stopped his crimes. But now he was back and clearly wanting to still play with his victims and the police. What investigators knew of the man they were looking for was fairly limited. They were looking for a white male around 5'10", a slender athletic build, 9 to 9.5 size shoe, type A blood, and physically agile, and he had a particularly small penis. He always wore a mask covering his face and was likely between 18 to 25 years old when the attacks began in 1976, meaning that by 2001 he should have been, by their calculations, between 40 and 50 years old. He likely lived near where the attacks were taking place. The psychological profile they came up with was quite interesting. He likely engaged in brutal sex in his personal life and often had sex with prostitutes. He clearly had knowledge of police investigative methods and evidence gathering techniques. He was sexually functional, he had no trouble performing. They believed that he worked, but not in early morning hours. He was intelligent, articulate. He hated women for perceived wrongs that they'd done to him. He was likely neat and very well organised and enjoyed voyeurism. He was self-assured and confident. They tried to follow up across the USA to see if any other states had experienced similar crimes, but as of 2015, nothing had been reported. From this, they assumed that he was likely incarcerated or dead, as I said. I don't think anyone expected him to still be alive and living a normal, law-abiding life. This call to the survivor wasn't the first call, though, that the perpetrator had used to cause concern. We note that he liked to often call his victims before the attacks and hang up or breathe funny down the phone, but he would also often call them after. In 1977, he called a previous victim saying, "Merry Christmas, it's me again." He's thought to have made multiple calls to the authorities over the years, taunting them, telling them how they're never going to catch him. Each time the police received a phone call, a victim would be attacked the very same night. In 1982, a previous victim received a phone call at the restaurant she worked at, where the man threatened to rape her again. The police thought the rapist must have been a patron there that night and recognised her. In 1991, a previous victim received a phone call where she spoke with the perpetrator for a whole minute. She said that she could hear a woman and children in the background, leading to speculation the man had a family. I think the extent to which this man was willing to go back and taunt his victims, the confidence he had in contacting police and knowing he wouldn't get caught, speaks a lot to the type of perpetrator we're talking about here. And his confidence was well placed, it seems, because for years the police had nothing. They had many suspects, all of whom we now know were innocent. The real man, Joseph Deangelo, was never even a thought. In 2016, the FBI released further information about the crimes of the Golden State Killer, including new composite sketches and details about the crimes. They also announced a $50,000 reward for any information. It was a digital media campaign, including the launch of FBI.gov/East Area Rapist. There were digital billboards throughout the country, social media outreach, and audio broadcasts via podcasts and radio PSAs. They were asking the public to play an active role in helping law enforcement, asking them the following questions. Did they live in one of the areas of criminal activity and remember somebody in the area who matched the physical description of the subject, or someone who may have been known to spend considerable amount of times in these areas? Have they potentially discovered a hidden collection of items amongst the belongings of friends or family members, notably coins and jewellery, as described in the FBI webpage about the crime? Remember how the East Area Rapist would take jewellery trophies from his victims? The police were basically begging the public for any leads. This was in 2016, but still there was nothing until 2018. Until April 24th, 2018, when Joseph Deangelo was apprehended at his Citrus Heights home at the age of 72. The DNA had been his downfall, which law enforcement uploaded to GEDmatch, a free online database where anyone can share their DNA data. At the time of this search, there were nearly 1 million DNA profiles uploaded to GEDmatch. It was launched in 2010, and for years it was just this obscure website that allowed customers of DNA testing firms to expand their family trees by looking for relatives sharing matching DNA. But the Californian police and the FBI worked with a professional genealogist to match crime scene DNA samples to profiles in GEDmatch. And they struck gold when they found DNA matches to this killer's third and fourth cousins. They had links with a very basic family tree. So now all they had to do was narrow it down to the man they were looking for. This did cause a bit of outrage because it was the first time a technique like this had been used on such a high profile case, but as we know, it's been used to solve multiple crimes since, especially Jane and John Doe cases. There were concerns over the genetic privacy of the users, so now if you're uploading DNA to GEDmatch, you have to explicitly opt in for use by law enforcement. A change that actually did drastically reduce the number of users who made their genetic information available for use by law enforcement. Luckily in 2018 this wasn't really a thing and the police could use this DNA data however they wanted to. They found family members directly related to a great-great-great-great-grandfather of Joseph Deangelo, dating back to the 1800s. Based on this, investigators built 25 different family trees to work through. Don't underestimate how many people that these trees consisted of. The family tree that contained Deangelo alone consisted of about 1,000 people. Over the next few months, investigators narrowed their suspects down by sex, age, place of residence, until eventually Joseph Deangelo was the only viable suspect. The police then surveilled him for many days before surreptitiously collecting a DNA sample from the door handle of his car and taking a used tissue from the bin left outside his house. Both samples matched with the DNA found at the scenes of the crimes. He was home alone when he was arrested. His family, because he did have a whole family, were out. He told the police he had a roast in his oven, but was placed under arrest without incident. He did give a confession of sorts. He basically blamed the crimes on an inner personality named Jerry, who apparently forced him to commit the crimes. Slowly, information began to come out about the man who terrorised California for over a decade. Joseph Deangelo was born on the 8th of November 1945 in Bath, New York. He had 2 younger sisters and 1 younger brother. One relative has since come forward saying that at the age of 9 or 10, he witnessed his 7-year-old sister being raped by 2 airmen in West Germany, where I assume his family had moved as part of his father's job. He was a US Army sergeant. Being witness of something like this would probably be a vague explanation for his later crimes if this is indeed true. Not making them excusable by any means, but seeing something like this at such a pivotal moment in childhood, especially if he was to already have a proclivity towards violence, would probably mess anyone up a bit, probably, or it's just a family member trying to make excuses. His family moved to California at some point where he attended school. In September 1964, he joined the US Navy, serving during the Vietnam War as a damage controlman for 22 months. After the war, he set his sights on becoming a police officer. He gets an associate degree in police science, and then he goes on to attend Sacramento State University, where he earns a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. He takes police training at the College of the Sequoias in Visalia and then completes a 32-week police internship at the Roseville Police Department. From 1973 to 1976, he worked with the burglary unit in Exeter, which just so happens to be very near Visalia at the same time as the Visalia ransackings. He then serves in Auburn from 1976 to 1979, where he's arrested and fired for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent, which in hindsight were definitely items he was using as the East Area Rapist, who was very much active at this time. The authorities were always baffled how dogs never seemed to cause much of an issue at these crime scenes. Now they had their answer: he used dog repellent. There was never any suspicion that Deangelo was the East Area Rapist. I'm sure there would have been a lot of conversation about the crimes whilst he was still working as a police officer, but his colleagues at the time described him as very much an average person, an average Joe. He was a proud newlywed, giving colleagues a tour of his new home. He wasn't particularly secretive, he didn't hide away. It also turned out that Joseph Deangelo had been married since 1973 to Sharon Marie Huddle. In 1980, they purchased the house in Citrus Heights, where he would later be arrested. Sharon becomes an attorney in the early 80s, and they go on to have 3 daughters. He was living with his daughter and granddaughter at the time of his arrest, it seems. This timeline matches up quite well with when the crimes went quiet. A lot of serial criminals, rapists, and murderers simply get too busy to continue with their crimes whilst raising a family. For 27 years, from around 1990, Deangelo worked at a distribution centre for the grocery store Save Mart before he retired in 2017, just the year before he was arrested. A spokesman for Save Mart has said, "None of his actions in the workplace would have led us to suspect any connection to crimes being attributed to him." He matched the descriptions of the man that each surviving victim made, although he would have been around 30 years old at the time the crimes really started to begin, which is slightly older than most described him. This is a man who had an ability to live an incredibly normal life. He had a wife and daughters. He's described by everyone who knew him in real life as being a completely normal guy. Some neighbours described him as sometimes having loud outbursts, a bit of a temper. One neighbour said his family received a phone call from Deangelo threatening to deliver a load of death because of their barking dog. So yeah, he was a guy with a temper, he had very much anger issues, but there was never any clues that he was the criminal as violent and shocking as the Golden State Killer. His family never had any clue he was a good husband, a good dad, although now his wife has of course filed for divorce, as you would expect. He has now entered a plea of guilty on 74 counts, including 13 counts of first-degree murder. Although the statute of limitations has passed on many of the rapes and burglaries, he has admitted to them as part of the plea deal. It was estimated that the trial could have cost the taxpayers at least $20 million and lasted 10 years, with the sheer amount of evidence that would need to be covered. A plea deal has saved a lot of pain for surviving victims, and if reports that Deangelo was ill are true, he likely wouldn't have survived through a 10-year trial. At least this way the victims get an element of closure, although I'm sure nothing makes up for the pain of living with that trauma for so many decades. So there are many people who would like him to sit through a trial for 10 years, but the chances are he just wouldn't survive till the end, and this sheer amount of evidence, it would have cost so much money, so much time, so much effort for a man who's frankly just not worth it. I really hope that now the surviving victims and their family members can have some sort of closure, can finally relax. I can't imagine for years, decades, knowing that your rapist, the person who's traumatised you, is still out there somewhere just living their life, potentially doing it to other people. I imagine for a lot of people it's like finally being able to relax, finally being able to breathe properly. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.